Hidden deep in the sleepy Leicestershire countryside, the reservoir at Swithland provides a secluded home for a wide range of wildlife. And it's here, across these waters, that you can hear the defiant call of a species living at the very edge of extinction. Steam power on the Great Central. The original Great Central Railway lost its individual identity in 1923 when it became part of the London and North Eastern Railway. But when British Rail decided to scrap part of the main line between Loughborough and Leicester, local steam enthusiasts formed a new company, Great Central Railway 1976 Limited. The aim of the company was to preserve at least part of the old London Extension main line and to run a regular steam-hauled passenger service between Loughborough Central and the village of Roadley. When it was originally opened to London-bound passenger traffic in 1899, the line was intended for fast running. With shallow curves and gradients kept down to 1 in 176, it was designed for expresses travelling at speeds of up to 80 miles an hour. Today, one track has gone, a victim of the harsh laws of economics, and the trains are limited to more modest speeds, giving you time to enjoy lunch in the restaurant car, or perhaps just to dream of days gone by. If we could take our train further south, through Leicester and Rugby, we'd pass within 8 miles of the market town of Buckingham. But no map of the Great Central shows any connection between the town and the main line. To find the branch to Buckingham, we have to go a lot further south yet. As far south, in fact, as Cornwall. To the residents of St. Newland East near Newquay, the Reverend Peter Denny is just the vicar of their beautiful parish church. But to railway modelers, he is something of a legend, the creator of Britain's most famous layout.
My interest in railways, I suppose, began when I was quite small, and from my nursery window I could see trains going in and out of a station which was a few hundred feet below. Not a particularly interesting station because it had no sidings and only a crossover in the middle, which I never saw used. The one interesting thing was that 5 o'clock in the afternoon a goods train always went through. We were always interested to see exactly how long it was going to be, because it was usually a very long one in those days. When I was 7, I had my first Hornby Railway set, and it gave me a great deal of pleasure, and I attempted, even those early days, to build certain things and add to the railway, and including setting up a certain amount of scenery. The whole thing was arranged on the nursery floor, and My father was very accommodating because he allowed me to put down sheets of dark brown paper. Then we screwed the railway to the floor right through the carpet and ballasted it with chicken grit. And so we began to get my first idea of making the railway look a little bit more realistic than that which came straight out of the set box. And then the war came and all railways were forgotten, and it wasn't until after the war that all the equipment had been put in store, and when I saw it again, the interest revived in model railways. At the time I thought it would be a very good thing if I did take up a particular hobby. And so I decided that I would pursue the model railway interest, and as I was living in a flat at the time, it was really necessary to go into a smaller scale. So all the Hornby stuff was sold, and we started with a 4mm scale. I had in the pre-war years read the Model Railway News. I'd always been particularly interested in the achievements of the Reverend Edward Beale in his 4mm scale modelling and his approach to modelling. And at that time I decided I would build a 4mm layout. The question was the question of gauge. At the time all toy trains ran on 16.5. But there were people who were suggesting that a more exact gauge could be obtained by using 18mm scale, 18mm gauge, and still working to 4mm scale. And with the introduction of 18mm driving axles by a certain commercial firm, this really decided me that I would attempt to build in 18mm gauge. Despite the fact that the trade were constantly telling us that they had enough trouble with 16.5, let alone going into 18mm. And of course the other challenge at the time was going into 2-rail, whereas most of the pre-war trains had always worked on 3-rail. So I began experimenting, and I found that it was quite possible to move the wheels along the axles to fit the 18mm gauge track, and I built my first locomotive. I'd never done any metal work before. I'd worked a lot in wood, and I'd always been very keen on making models and reproducing what I had seen in miniature. So I had quite a skill with the hands, and the first locomotive was built in metal. My first attempt really at soldering using an electric iron, which I'd never done before, and soon found it very easy to get on with. And the first locomotive is actually still working on Buckingham today. So it was just before an exhibition. I built a small station, and there was an exhibition in London at the time, and I was tempted to put it into the competition section, which I did, and I was most surprised to receive a bronze medal, and that really persuaded me that I had some ability in this direction. And so I set about building a layout to fit into the flat in which I was then living. Of course it had to be a portable layout, or semi-portable, and I only had one room at the time. And this is really the origins of Buckingham.
The Buckingham branch of today instantly dispels any confusion between railway modelling and playing trains. And one reason for the great success of the layout must lie in choosing an attractive and credible prototype within the capability of the modeller.
Anyone who starts to build a model railway has to make certain decisions. First of all, are you going to build a particular company, and if so, which one? In my early days I joined the Model Railway Club, and I was interested to find that most people there were building the Great Western. In fact, many people seem to know everything about the Great Western and were very critical of everybody's efforts in producing any models. The chimney was not quite the right shape, or there should have been more rivets in this particular place, or that. And so I decided to go for a more obscure company. I'd always been interested in the Great Central engines. They were fairly simple and straightforward in their design. As I knew that I had got to build everything myself, since after the war there was hardly anything on the market that was available commercially, I decided I would settle for the Great Central. It sounds as impressive as the Great Western. Actually, I knew very little about it then in those days, and I had to do a certain amount of research. In fact, quite a considerable amount of research before I could get very far in doing any building. I was fortunate, however, in that I met a man from Sheffield who was a keen enthusiast and was a keen photographer. And he lent me a vast collection of his photographs, and it is from those photographs that I really began starting to build models of the Great Central Railway. The other decision, of course, that has to be made is how you're going to fit it into the space that is available. And the space available is always less than what one would like to have. So I decided it would be very useful to go back into the past and do some historical research, and also the advantage that in the early days of the railways that engines were much smaller and trains were much shorter. And the shorter the train, the easier it is to fit into a limited amount of space. With that in mind, I settled for what I consider now to be the golden years of railways before the First World War. And on making inquiries about the Great Central, I found that it had what I required. First of all, the engines I mentioned before were simple in their design. They had no outside cylinders to worry about. Secondly, that the signal posts were made of wood and not of lattice girder, because lattice girder presents a hopeless problem in trying to reproduce in miniature, although it is possible to do it now. And the third point, of course, that I had to consider was what sort of colour did the coaches have. And I always had an abhorrence of teak, and I found that, because it's difficult to reproduce in miniature, I found that the Great Central did have teak coaches, but when they opened the London extension, they changed their colour to brown and cream. And so between the years 1898 and 1907, Great Central coaches were in brown and cream. And that decided me on the year in which I should settle for my modelling, the heyday of the Edwardian period, the year 1907. Having settled on the railway company and the period, the next thing I had to decide was what part of the Great Central system I should locate my model railway. I have already mentioned I had built a small station. At that time I hadn't given it a name, but putting it into an exhibition I felt it should have a name on it, and I consulted a map and looked for an impressive town somewhere near the Great Central main line which had not received a station, and my eye lighted upon Buckingham. Thereupon Buckingham became the focal point of the model railway system, although the small station that I had completed was not to be called Buckingham but to be a branch from Buckingham, namely Stony Stratford. The next thing then was to decide, since Buckingham had not got a station, I had great freedom then in designing my particular layout. And this involved, of course, all the questions of planning. I've always felt that in order to have an interesting railway, one needs to have a point-to-point running with the possibility of an exchange of traffic with a branch line. I've never found any interest in trains going round and round, and although of course at the time most people thought of railways as being continuous, well of course there are certain people who like to sit down and just watch their railways going round and round, but I'm much more interested in shunting. Perhaps I suppose that was the interest I had when I used to watch the real thing. I was never a railway spotter. I was never interested in railway numbers or in collecting the engines I'd seen, but I was interested in the way they uncoupled the wagons and shunted them down, and how engines went backwards and forwards and did all sorts of little jobs like that. Little things like that pleased me much more, and so when I wanted a railway, I wanted one where there would be plenty of opportunity for shunting. So we set off then with the idea of a largish sort of terminus running into a imaginary countryside and then ending up in some hidden sidings which could represent the rest of the whole of the railway system of this country, with going off on the other side a branch line ending in a very small terminus. So it had the possibility of trains coming in, particularly goods trains, and being sorted, and a certain amount of wagons being sent off to the small little branch line terminus, while at the same time you could provide a push and pull or local service between the terminus and the smaller branch terminus. And this pattern I have more or less preserved right the way through my railway modelling. In the years after the war, there was very little available commercially, and so there was no alternative but to get down to building everything oneself. I have already decided that it was to be 18mm, and certainly there was no 18mm track available. So I adopted the simple method of building track, of using some small steel nails and soldering the track to the head of the nails. And I've continued using the same method right the way through, and have found it extremely a satisfactory one. Some of the track has been now for over 30 years and is still giving good service. The other decision, of course, that had to be made was how you're going to couple your various wagons and coaches together. I'd always had an abhorrence of automatic couplings, which seemed to spoil the effect because I never found them on the real thing. And from the very beginning I started using the 3-link couplings, but it did evolve, of course, a certain amount of fiddling when one wants to couple and uncouple the various coaches and wagons. And as the railway has increased in size, of course, much more of that activity is involved. Nevertheless, the problem, of course, is with using 3-link couplings that you can have buffer locking, and this is one of the major problems that really had to be solved. And the answer, as I find it, is that one must keep to fairly large radius curves, and that with the question of coaches, there are certain dodges one can adopt of arranging crossovers on the curve so that you can eliminate certain movements and avoid what is a reverse curve and causes so many problems with buffer locking. You will notice this happens on the Buckinghams of all periods. My approach to railway modelling has always been rather artistic than mechanical. I've always felt that I wanted to reproduce a picture, as it were, in 3 dimensions, and of course a moving picture at that. So I felt I could never be confined to any particular railway station or a section of the real thing. In any case, a compromise has to be made, and it's quite impossible to reproduce even the smallest branch line station completely to full scale, because it would take up far too much room. So I decided I'd be completely free in my design of the model railway. And I set about building and designing a station which would appeal to the appearance. I mentioned a moment ago about the 3-link couplings, and this also does decide how the station is arranged. It's very important, if you're going to do a lot of shunting, that all the goods yard and shunting movement should be on the near side of the baseboard, whereas the engine sheds, and where there's not a great deal of uncoupling and coupling to do, should be on the further side. This determined part of the shape that the very first Buckingham took, and of course it's been pursued right the way through. The approach to building a scenic model then does not entail the exact reproduction of the real thing. And here again I developed my own particular philosophy, and that is to start off with the locomotives themselves. They, I would feel, should be as exact a replica as one can build, but perhaps looked at a distance, not at a close quarters. And I usually consider that if I cannot see detail 2 feet away, then it's hardly worth putting in. And this applies to much of the things that go underneath the trains, whereas today we find the models that are produced by the trade, great detail is put in, and well, many children today feel they must have all these details available. On the other hand, my approach has been to look at the railway as a whole. Rather, I suppose, I would favour the sort of impressionist approach to art, where you get the general impression. And so I've never worried a great deal about details that are not there. It's surprising, you know, one of my friends who had been helping to operate the railway and been running a succession of trains, and as I was packing it up at the end of the day, it was an exhibition, he said to me, let me have a look closer at your coaches. I didn't notice how you did the lettering. So you didn't notice? Well, there wasn't any lettering to notice, because it wasn't there. But because the coach created the right impression, therefore he felt that the lettering had been there. He'd been looking at it most of the afternoon. So we get this philosophy then of creating a picture in 3 dimensions. And building the railway also entails a certain balance of picture. Buckingham as it exists today, in fact it has always existed, has been divided into sections. One way of dividing it, of course, is to have road overbridges, splitting it up into smaller areas, and then each area becomes a little picture, as it were, in itself. Just as in creating a picture on canvas, one does one's balance and you get your lines right. So building a modern railway, I found you need to have balance, you need to have height in certain places. So on Buckingham you will find that we go up at one end with the church tower, and then we come down again but go up again with the gas holder, and then perhaps down again, up again with some final trees or so. This is all part of creating the picture. I've sort of spent quite a lot of time thinking how it's going to be a pleasing array, and particularly when I sit down at the operating point and look at the railway from that angle, and that is the angle in which I create the picture. My approach to scratch building has always been that the most important thing on the railway are the locomotives, and these I like to reproduce as accurately as I am able, again viewing them from a distance of about 2 feet. After the locomotives then, the coaches are the next important things, and I like that these should be also as accurate as I can for the period in which I am modelling. The same would apply to the goods wagons. But when we come to the buildings, station buildings, signal cabins, locomotive sheds and other features, I'm quite happy to take those from any part of the Great Central System. And so they would be buildings that could have appeared on the Great Central Railway, but of course I gleaned them from various sources, mostly from photographs that I have seen, and have reproduced my own drawings and designs from the photographs. Moving further outwards though, beyond the railway company fence, I'm quite happy to take buildings from any part of the country and to incorporate them in the railway. And so when you look at Buckingham Railway, you'll see, for example, there is a manor house which originates in Cornwall, and also Launceston Gateway, which is again in Cornwall. But on the other hand, you will also find there is Buckingham Town Hall, which definitely has come from Buckingham. It is simply collecting together buildings which have character and trying to arrange them again on this whole basis of creating a picture. The original Buckingham was a semi-portable affair. The main station, Buckingham, was the bit that was permanent, and the rest of it was arranged as portable sections that plugged in and which were closed down rather sandwich fashion, folding over, and had wheels on the bottom so they could be pushed around the floor and were stored underneath the main section. This eventually became a completely portable layout, and in order to fit it in the room at one stage we spanned it over the double bed, often with my wife in it while operating sessions took place. That did not prove to be 100% successful, so then we ran it out the door along into the corridor. That again was equally unsuccessful. It meant you couldn't shut the door. And subsequently we moved to another house where the only place it could be put up was in the living room. This again had great disadvantage because once it was up in the living room we couldn't get into the kitchen without ducking under the baseboard. And it was at that time that my mind began to turn to the possibility of a railway in the garden. What I would have liked to have had, of course, was a Gauge 1 railway, but then the expense of buying that sort of equipment and even possessing a lathe in order to create it was quite impossible. And so I settled for a compromise. I would build a 10mm scale railway to run on O-gauge track and to represent a 3-foot narrow gauge line such as we find in the Isle of Man and in many of the Irish railways. I also decided that this should be a railway that was not going to cost very much to produce. At that time it was possible to buy the old Hornby plastic wheels, 2 wheels on 1 axle for 3 old pence, and with some pieces of wood I was able to construct wagons and coaches. The locomotives presented a certain problem, but I had a good friend who was willing to sell me some pre-war clockwork mechanisms, and with these I was able to start building the engines which are running on the Garden Railway that I possess today. The railway, Garden Railway has grown on and off over, I suppose, the past 30 years. Much of the stock that I built in the early days is still running, although much of it has been added as the railway has increased.